Hello, viewers and listeners. It's your co-host Stu. I'm here with Patty, the paranormalist, and Patty has an interesting episode for us today. It's going to be part one of two. Patty, what's our
Um,
topic?
we're going to talk about time travel. Now, at first glance, it sounds like a bizarre topic, but it's really interesting. And there are a lot of stories that kind of themselves to this. So the first type of time travel, because there's many types of time travel. The first type of time travel I'm going to talk about is accidental time travel. So I have to tell you, years ago, I was here in Bedford and I was at a building in town here that was well known for being haunted. And I was there about the haunting, just visiting the building, trying to collect some stories. And this one lady was very quiet. And there was a break in the conversation because the woman who was talking to me had to go answer the phone and deal with some business. And this lady who was sitting in her office that was quiet, she finally spoke up and she said, I didn't want to tell just anyone, but I don't think you'll think I'm crazy. And that's whenever I always get a good story.
Right,
And I
right,
said,
right.
no, no, go ahead and tell me the story. And she said she had worked in this building for years. And one day she was up on the second floor of the building and she was in the back, far left hand side at the front, waiting in that office for a staff meeting. And she said, I was bored and everybody was moving slow. So I decided to just go up and get myself settled and be ready. And she was kind of walking around the room looking out the window. And that's when she had this weird experience. Now, Bedford is an old town and the buildings are very old. Some of the buildings are very, very old. And she's looking out the window and all of a sudden she said it was like a heat chimera, that wave of heat. And
Sure.
then everything changed. She wasn't looking at the building across the street, and none of the buildings across the street existed. There was an old building off on the right hand side, and it was a tavern. And that was the only building. There were pigs, there were people in colonial clothing, there were dogs barking and children running down the street. And it was very much like a scene out of a colonial movie. And she said, I stood there like, don't blink, don't blink. And she's watching this thing and trying desperately hard not to look away because, she just had this feeling if she looked away, it would be gone.
Right.
And eventually somebody came in the door. And when they came in the door, she said, they said something to me and I said, come look at this. And she turned her head just slightly and it was gone.
Wow.
And I consider that an accidental time slip,
Mhm.
traveling in time. And there are a lot of these stories. So we're going to start with these tonight. And then the next time we get together, I want to talk about intentional ones where people deliberately have set out to time travel and how that's occurred. And it's a fascinating subject. It's even probably to me more interesting because it means that there's a technology, and I know you love tech stuff, but
I
there's
do.
a technology
So,
that's at play.
yeah, listening to your friend's story though, I got two thoughts that came through my head. So the first thought was, okay, so was what she was seeing similar to like a residual haunting, whereas something repeats over and over again, an event repeats over and over again, or was she in a bubble and viewing the past and like she didn't change? So if the people in there, so it'd be one of two things. So if they were cognizant of her, if they could see her, then I would say she would be in a bubble.
Right.
But if they were not aware of her, then I would say it would be more of a repetitive haunt, a residual energy kind of thing. And
So there's one other theory, and
okay.
that's that we live in a series of dimensions, and we're in our dimension, and there's another dimension, and another, and another, and another, and another, like layers, and that the same people and the same things exist in all these dimensions, but in different ways. So maybe in a different dimension, it was 1700s, and she just peered through into that dimension. That's another possibility.
Yeah,
Um,
I thought of that. Hmm.
but I think there's a story that might give you more of an answer than if I tried to answer it myself. The story is a very famous one. It's about these two school teachers in 1901, is August of 1901, and they went to Paris, and were going to have the time of their life. They were going to go to all the different historical sites. They were going to explore Marie Antoinette and her life. They were going to go to museums, just have a wonderful, wonderful time. So they are, their names are Anne Moberly, M-O-B-E-R, Moberly, and Eleanor Jourdain. And they are having an absolutely gorgeous time. This was their trip of a lifetime for these two ladies. And they're at Versailles, the palace at Versailles, where Marie Antoinette had lived. And there's a section of it called, and I apologize if I butcher the French, the Petit Trianon. And it's like a little chateau where Marie Antoinette would go to be reflective and relax and be at peace. So they're down there kind of looking around, and it's interesting because the ladies would later write about it in their journals, and this is how we would come to find out about it. Eleanor Jourdain would write, "Everything suddenly looked unnatural, therefore unpleasant. Even the trees seemed to become flat and lifeless." And the other woman, that would be Anne, she would say that they had crossed a bridge and had reached a little garden in front of the palace when they came across a lady sitting in the grass sketching. Now, the lady looked remarkably like Marie Antoinette's portraits, and she was wearing period clothing. Today, we would think reenactors.
Right.
I don't know that that would have been applicable in that time frame. And as she's watching, this gentleman by the name of Count Derival appears around the turn on the road, and he goes up to Marie Antoinette. Now, I've read more detailed accounts, and supposedly a carriage came up, and this gentleman hurried and handed this lady up into the carriage. There was a sense of urgency, and the carriage took off down the road. Well, when the ladies got back to the main part of the museum area where they first entered the buildings, the gentleman who was the curator there asked them how things had gone, and did they have any questions. And they said, well, we just want to know who were the people and that we saw. And they explained what had happened. And he was very puzzled, and he said, no, there was nobody down there. They're like, no, there was a guy, and he looked like, and they explained the whole thing. And the event that they explained actually had happened. So apparently this was toward the end of her life. Marie Antoinette was, was in a dangerous situation where there was a lot of, the revolution was going on. There were a lot of French aristocrats who were being executed by the guillotine and hung and what have you. And she was worried, and everybody was frightened for her. And so there was a plan put together to help her to escape. And it was this day of the plan that it sounded like it was. This gentleman who came was the man who came for her. There was a horse and carriage that suddenly appeared out of nowhere. He put her on it. They whisked her away. I don't believe she succeeded in getting away, but it's interesting. And I just thought that the idea that it was very unpleasant, everything seemed flat and lifeless, almost like it was 2D, not 3D, from the way she describes it. So I'm not sure if it was she peering into a different dimension and things were a little warped? Did she look literally back into history? There's a lot of different possibilities.
Yeah, that would make me think more interdimensional if you saw it in 2D, almost like you were seeing it on a screen.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but yeah, that's a really interesting tale.
And it's only one of so many of these kinds of stories. In 1935, Victor Goddard, who was a commander of the British Royal Air Force, was flying to Edinburgh, and during his flight, he flew across an old airfield at Durham, Scotland, and it was as he expected it to be. It was abandoned and just sitting there like a little empty airfield, some cattle in the fields around it, and there was nothing much about it. On his way back home, he would again fly the same circuit, so he would go back across it. There had been a very bad storm. He ended up in the storm, and he talked about the wind, and it was very violent, and then he got disoriented. And when he gets out of the storm and he looks down, it's the same Air Force, or the same base, air base in Durham, Scotland, but now it's clean, it's neat. He sees yellow planes all lined up. There's men who are in uniforms. They're like a blue kind of uniform, like a one-piece jumpsuit type thing. And there's this plane. He recognizes some of the planes, but there's this one plane that's standing out on the airfield that he's never seen before. And he thought he knew a good bit about the planes. Well, he's fascinated by what he's seeing. And then the storm's back. He's in the middle of it again. The clouds kind of swamp the plane. And when he comes out, he's further away, and he makes it home safely. So he doesn't know what to make of what he saw. It didn't make sense until several years ago, or go by, and he realizes that what he saw was the base being reclaimed at the beginning of World War II. Now, they would end up reclaiming the base. They painted the planes yellow. The plane he described that he couldn't he didn't recognize. He gave a great description of it in his journals, and it was a plane that was developed after his vision, if you will. He would write the story in a book, and it was entitled, the book's entitled Flight Toward Reality. And he would tell this story of what he saw.
That sounds like a time bubble where he flies into it, is into it, and then flies back out of it. Yeah, that's. But what would cause such a thing naturally?
Well, if you go to the Bermuda Triangle, okay.
No thanks.
They talk about the same kind of thing. They flew into a storm, and maybe it's not a storm. Maybe it's a time warp, or a hole in the fabric where you can go through the dimensions. Do you ever remember seeing, there was a show on when I was young, a young adult, what's it called? Sliders. And it was about this guy who manages to get, he's a college kid, and he's working on this project, and he manages to create a machine that will open wormholes and cause him to slide through them into other times. And he ends up taking with him his college professor, a girl who was in the classroom with him, and of all things, a gentleman who was a singer who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and got sucked up in this whole mess. But the problem is he damages the machine, and so he doesn't have any control on when they slide or where they slide to. And his hope is that sooner or later they'll slide back into their reality. And then what happened every time was that this kind of whirlpool effect would occur. But that kind of thing was actually displayed and described by people multiple times when they've had these kinds of experiences, particularly in the Bermuda Triangle, where they sail or fly into a storm. It's, disorienting, and you see this swirling mass of darkness in front of you, and then boom, you're in the different dimension, or you're in a different place or a different time, whatever it ends up being, and you see things that you shouldn't. And then usually they slip back eventually. Some of them do anyway. And then they tell their story. The Great Lakes, you hear some of the same types of stories in the Great Lakes.
Interesting.
There's several places in the world that this happens. So I don't know if that's, if it's basically that there's a disturbance or a ripple that causes you to get sucked into it, or to be sucked through it in the other way. So we've talked about people going back in time, and now we're going to talk about somebody in our time frame who was the person who witnessed something of interest. So in 1988, Strange Magazine published a story that they claimed was based on a true event that happened on October the 20th of 1969. Now, the story was written up by one of the two businessmen from this little town towards Lafayette, Louisiana. Their story was that they were on Highway 167, and in front of them um, is this car, very old-fashioned looking car from the 1940s. And they're puzzled by this car. It has an orange license plate. It's very retro looking, and they're kind of like, why is that car driving so slow? And, what is going on? And when they get closer, they realize the license plate actually says 1940. So there's very little doubt that that's when it was. Now, they kind of pull up close to the car because the car is going immensely slow. And they see this woman with a little girl sitting in the passenger seat, and the woman's gripping the steering wheel, and she's looking, and she's scared to death. You can see from her body language she's terrified, and she's wearing 1940s clothing, and so is the child. Well, when she sees this car rip up beside her, it panics her even more, and she pulls off the road. And they're like, there's something wrong with these people. So they pull off the road in front of her to see if they can help her. And when they get pulled off the road and go to get out of the car, all of a sudden, car's gone. It didn't ripple. It didn't fade. It's just they pull off and open the car door, and in that instance, the car is just gone. Now, here's what makes this story really interesting. Some of the newspapers from the area came up with a story of a woman in 1940s who disappeared on that road. Her and her little girl were driving home and just simply disappeared. Is it possible she's still trying to find her way home?
Well, certain seems plausible at any rate.
It's an interesting story. And I just thought, we hear all these larger ones, like, you're going to go check out Marie Antoinette and stuff, but there's a lot of these stories that people just don't realize exist, and they're very small stories. I mean, stories of people who were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, so to speak. And these people are tourists, and they're housewives and businessmen and stuff like this, and they're not out looking for this stuff. It just falls on them. They're just suddenly there. One of my favorite stories was about the British tourists who stayed in a hotel that didn't exist. Now, this is a story that you hear repeated all over. There's a similar story in Washington State, but let's just go with this story and explain it to you. So there was two couples from England who were traveling the north part of France in 1979, and they were on their way to Spain. Now, what they would do is they would drive along. If anything looked interesting, they weren't on a timetable, they would pull over, check it out, and every night they would just find a hotel, B&B, something to stay at. So on this one night, they pull over at a building that looks like it's a motel, and there's men standing out front smoking, and they say that, the couples inquire, is this a good place to stay for the night? And they said, oh, it's an inn. Yes, you'll love it there. You'll love it. And they go inside, and it's very quaint and old fashioned. It's got no phones. There's no modern conveniences. It's just completely as though it came out of the 19th century. So they order dinner, very simple food, very well done. There were two policemen who had caps and uniforms, and they were sitting there watching them. After they ate their dinner and what have you, they paid for the meal, and it was only like 19 francs, which was a few pennies. And the couple moved on. As they were headed toward, they thought they could get a few more hours of driving in the evening before they found a place to stay for the night. So 2 weeks go by, they're in Spain, and they're on their way back, and they said, hey, do you remember that same really quaint little motel? We should go there again on our way home. Get some pictures, kind of check it out, because we really didn't do that the first time. We were kind of hurrying, and we shouldn't have done that. We should have checked it out. So they decide to take exactly the same road home that they took going into Spain. So they're on their way back, and they get to the area where it should have been. They go into the town, they know the name of the town, they have all the stuff, written down, and town looks pretty much the same. They get to the area where it should be. There's nothing there. Nothing at all. Just an empty lot. Now, they had taken a couple photographs when they had gotten there that first night,
Okay.
and that's the only thing that exists to prove that it ever was there. And they would come to find out later through doing some research that there had been an inn there in the early 1900s.
So now imagine, all right. So I mean, they interacted with the people.
They did. They
Okay,
ate the
so
food.
they ate the food. They paid. So they would have had money that was minted in their era, printed or minted in their era, but yet they used it for somebody that would accept. Can you imagine somebody handing you a coin and you looking at it and it says, e pluribus unum U.S. government, and all of a sudden, instead of George Washington on the quarter, it's a sheep or something else on the quarter, it's not even a quarter, So imagine that. So you think something would have triggered something with the ancient innkeepers,
Yeah,
but
I mean, I don't know if the money looked the same or similar or what it was, but yeah, they talked, and they would have had modern clothing on,
mhm.
and they didn't seem to notice it at all. I don't know why, or at least they were polite and didn't say anything about it. And you'll hear that type of story. There's a story from Washington State about a guy and his wife who had gone to this little diner, and then on their way home, they also stopped at this diner, and this diner was burned out. And they were like, "Oh my God, that's awful," but it looks like it was burned a long time ago. And they started asking around, and here it had been burned out for like 15 years. And they had been there a few weeks earlier, so they couldn't explain how that happened. There's a street in London. We were saying about not noticing things. There's a wonderful story about a street in London, um, and it's notorious for there being some interesting time slips, if you will. So there's a couple stories from the street, but this one I'm gonna pass on as we'll kind of go to your story, your question, or your comments. So there was this young lady, and she was going to go buy a birthday gift for a friend. So she goes down to this street in London that she wasn't too far from home, and they had a lot of cute little kitschy shops and what have you. She sees a shop she had never been in before. She was actually kind of surprised she had never noticed it because it was kind of retro. And she goes in and she goes to buy her gift, and she hands the lady her credit card. And the lady's like, "What do I do with that?" And she's like, "You run it, you know?"
Mhm.
And she's like, "No, you need to give me money." And she's like, "Yeah, money." And she's waving the card. She's like, "No, money. I need money." And she's like, "I don't have any cash. Can't you take a credit card?" And the woman looked at her, and she pushed this little plastic card back, and she said, "I don't know what you're talking about." So the lady takes her card, the girl takes her card, and she goes home, and she's telling her mother this story about this crazy lady who wouldn't take a credit card. "Mom, isn't that crazy? There's a shop down there that won't even take a credit card." And her mother looks at her and she goes, "Where's this at?" And she says, where it's at again. She's like, "No, no, that's a little grocery store now." And she's like, "No, Mom, I was just there." And she describes it. So they decide to go for a walk and go down there, and it's a grocery store. It had been a grocery store for about 50 years.
No wonder the proprietor hadn't heard of a credit card or seen a credit card.
So that the woman was trying to cheat her. She kept giving her this plastic thing and saying, "Run it." And she's like, "Run what? What do you do with it?" So there's a lot of really interesting stories like that, stories that just don't fit. And among those stories that don't fit, I'd like to talk about a second type. So these are things that we are finding today that indicate that somewhere in time people have been in the past from the future. Let me explain. So in 2008, there were these archaeologists who were doing an excavation in southern China. And in this tomb that they had opened, they found was a Ming Dynasty era grave. It had been sealed 400 years ago, and they were opening the coffin to get a look at the mummified corpse of this person. And when they pulled the lid off, um, something fell out. And they looked down, and it was all covered in dirt. And they picked it up, and it felt like metal, and it looked like a bracelet or something. And they start wiping it off a little bit, to sort of get a better look at what it is.
Right.
I'm
Right.
sure visions of jewels might have been dancing in their head at that point. And when they look at it, it looks like a watch, like a regular wristwatch.
Okay.
And it's a watch in the shape of a ring, and they would later be able to clean it up and see that inside of the watch was inscribed the word Swiss. It was a Swiss watch. The hands of the watch were frozen at the time of 10:06. They never found any evidence that the grave had been tampered with. They had never found any evidence of how the watch got inside the tomb. And they have no idea where it came from. And interestingly enough, all the artifacts that would have been worth money were
Right.
still in place. So if somebody had broken in, had been trying to get something out of the tomb and dropped a watch 70 years ago or 50 years ago, they didn't take anything.
Was the I'm sure if it was a Swiss watch, it could have been dated to its manufacturer. Date of
I'm sure it
manufacture.
could be. I don't know if they ever did that. I'm not sure about that, but I will tell you that they did. They were able to date the age of the watch and what have you. So it was interesting to see some of these stories that are just so interesting. There is an article that appeared in, I read Countryside and Backwoods Home magazine, and years ago in Backwoods Home, there was an interesting ad. I would like to read it to you because this is an ad that kind of sums up the bizarreness of the whole topic. Wanted someone to go back in time with me. This is not a joke. And it gives a P.O. box and an address in California. You'll get paid after we get back. Must bring your own weapons. Safety is not guaranteed. I've only done this once before. And today everybody says it was a hoax, but there's no explanation for this ad.
Mm-hmm.
So, what was it and how did it get placed and who placed it? Nobody ever came forward to say.
Yeah, I think there is a movie that was based on that. It's called Safety Not Guaranteed.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I believe I watched it. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that was the name of the movie, Safety Not Guaranteed. But I had seen that too. And when you were saying about things that were like the watch in the tomb, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
if you've been around the internet, and who hasn't these days, I've seen pictures of things that have been found inside rocks,
Yeah.
electrical plugs, other things embedded in rocks that, like tools, modern
Phones.
tools. Yep,
Yeah,
exactly.
modern tools, phones,
Things like that.
all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, so that it may be more prevalent than what we think, and again, this is one of those theories of mine that our civilization today, so in what we call, 2000, it's now 2022. Thank goodness we're here. So the Earth's been around approximately 4.5 billion years, according to scientific dating. I've got the feeling that there have been other civilizations that have risen and declined, and millions of years ago. I mean, even predating dinosaurs and things like that. I think that they may not all be in the same place. So I mean, how can you explain things like the map of Antarctica that was found in the 1500s? Very detailed map. Okay, so that kind of stuff is, how did that come to be? How did anybody do anything with that kind of detail? And even showing geographical features that nowadays, or even in 1500s, would have been underneath ice and snow.
Right.
So
Or, the Nazca lines where you can't make any sense out of them until you're up high in the air. How did that happen? I agree with you. I'm a firm believer that there have been previous cultures that have been possibly even more advanced than ours. One of the things I find interesting is we don't talk about is that there are ancient batteries, there are ancient computers. If you go to Greece, they had plumbing, they had all of these things that we sit and pat ourselves in the back and go, well, I'm glad I live today because I have electricity and plumbing. Really, I think they did too in some respects. Maybe slightly different versions of it, but definitely there. Historically speaking, we know these things existed. We know what they were. There's a ship where they were that went down, and when they salvaged it, they found a clock face that dates back before the first known clock. And it was just sitting in the bottom of the ship, and they have no clue where it came from. But it looked like it was an artifact that had been packaged to be sent somewhere. But explain it. I've seen cell phones put, being chipped out of looks like rock. There's some really interesting things. There's an old Charlie Chaplin movie, and you can go on the internet and find out a little bit more about it. But there's a videographer who was going through the old, what they call daily rushes of the Charlie Chaplin movie. They were all kept, and he was going through all the outtakes and stuff. And he comes across this photograph or this picture, the video of this woman who was an extra in the movie, and she's on her cell phone, it looks like, and she's talking to somebody on the phone, or she's talking to her hand, one of the two.
It
And
looks that way. I've seen that picture.
yeah,
Yes.
it's interesting, isn't it?
And the one that along the similar vein, it looks like there's a guy in a hoodie standing in with a group of people in suits like you would expect to see in the 40s and 50s. Yeah.
What they call the hipster, I think is what they call that fella.
Right.
And so there are these out of time photographs and videos and what have you. And that's not the only one. There's 2 or 3 other videos of people using cell phones in the 1930s and 40s. And, videos and still photographs of them with this thing up to their mouth, and they're talking to it as they're walking down the street. And there's no clue what it was. There's a prize fight, where there's a man standing, and I'm sure you remember because you're more technically inclined than I am, because phones and stuff like that are just a tool to me, and I throw them on my bed when I'm done with them, and that's the end of it, and I forget about them. But I don't sit and go, whoo, that was really interesting. It made people talk to me. I'm good.
Different strokes. Yeah.
Everybody, no, and I wish I could be more technically inclined when it comes to that stuff. I just remember like stories and stuff like that. But anyhow, do you remember the cell phones that you used to have to hold sideways, and they would shoot the video? It was in the middle of your screen, in the back.
I kind of went from bag phones to the Nokia bar of soap phones. Right.
Okay. Well, there was a cell phone that, like, instead of holding it upright like this, whenever you did video, you would hold it like this and shoot video. There's video of a prize fight, and this prize fight was in, I think, the early 1970s, and there's a gentleman standing front foremost, very close to the very front of the audience, and he's got this phone, and he's like this, and he's videotaping, and the camera kind of comes around the whole thing because they're filming the prize fight, and you can see it looks like a cell phone.
Maybe I didn't think anything of that because I know movies are normally shot in 16:9 widescreen, so anytime I take a movie on my phone, or it's always, I always have it in that orientation. So I guess I didn't even think about that. So.
But there weren't even any cell phones at all at that point, early 70s. And then when we got our cell phones, they were like, I know people, they can't believe it, but they were literally a foot tall.
The Vietnam era walkie-talkies. Yeah.
Yes. And they were ridiculous to, they would carry them in a briefcase because they were so big, you had to have a suitcase to carry it in. And the cell phones in the cars that were in the cars, they looked like a regular old-fashioned house phone with a cord and the whole 9 yards. So the technology wasn't there, or at least it wasn't there publicly in any way we knew about it. So I just thought it was fascinating to see these photographs and these implements. But I seen some of those pictures you're talking about where they're showing an electrical plug, and it's pasted in the middle of this piece of rock, and they broke it open, and there it is. And where did it come from? So I love your theory about there being civilizations, and we have forgotten. I think there's a forgetfulness in us. Maybe it's a genetic memory, because I think there's also things we're disquieted about, and we know that they make us feel creeped out, but we can't tell you why. But why did we forget? Why did we stop progressing, or did we progress so far that it blew up in our faces?
Yeah, and yeah, I'm thinking something cataclysmic happened
Yeah.
at the end of each civilization, but yet there were certain people that still lived, but there wasn't any reason to, or there wasn't any method to continue to write. So we didn't have any written communication, and we just had oral communication at that point, and and then just things progress from there. It's just that's a theory of mine. It's not necessarily provable, but I just feel that look at that. There's just so many things that you can't explain, and that would explain some of the things that are unexplained. So again, it's a theory.
I think it's fascinating. I honestly do. And I have one more story I'd like to share, and then we will hopefully get together here shortly sometime, and we will talk about the other type of time travel whenever it's intentional, and maybe some explanations as to how it might work, or at least who might have developed it. So there's one more story I'd like to tell, and this is of a 30 of this gentleman who's from Sweden, and I'm going to say his last name because I could not even begin to hack my way through his first name. I apologize, but it's Nordqvist. And Nordqvist was the gentleman's name, and he claims that he met himself in the future. Now, it's interesting because it's, you think, okay, that's ridiculous. So he's just got a story to tell. But he says he has proof. He has a 167-second piece of film he shot on his cell phone of himself meeting himself for the first time. So the story goes that it was a day in August 2006. He was fixing the pipes in his kitchen sink, and he had crawled inside of a cabinet to get to some of the pipes. And as he was crawling to the pipes, he realized there was like a little bit of a tunnel, and he needed to go down in there to double check that nothing else was leaking. So he crawls down through there to see his pipes, and make sure there's nothing else leaking before he gets out of that mess. Not wanting to go back in there again if he doesn't have to. So he crawls until he sees what looks like a light at the other end of the tunnel. And that's when he realized, as he stepped out on the other side, he wasn't in Kansas anymore, so to speak.
Right.
He doesn't recognize anything. And he's disoriented. He sees this figure, this person who looks a lot like him, but he's an old man, and he's got some extra weight around his neck, his chest, and his stomach. And but here's the thing: he had the tattoos that this guy had. They were more faded, but they were exactly the same tattoos in exactly the same places, including the one on his neck. And he said to this man, "Who are you?" And he gave him his name, and he said, "No, you can't be him. I'm him." And he said, "No, that's my name." And he said, "Wait a second." And he started asking him questions. "Tell me what your dog's name was when you were 10, and where did you live when you were 7, and do you remember what happened at such and such a house?" And the guy gave him answer for answer. Exactly the truth, every single thing. So he claims that in his 30s, he crawled through this tunnel, came out on the other end, and there, standing in his kitchen, but in a different dimension, was himself at the age of about 72, with his same tattoos, the same hairline, of whole 9 yards. And this guy knew everything about his life.
Again, questions. Okay, so if he knew everything about his life, he would also have the recollection of crawling into the cabinet to go look at the pipes and fix the pipes.
You would think, but he didn't seem to know that part. He just knew,
And
like, he knew what the dog's name was. So maybe he had a parallel life, but not exact. But he remembered that
so
the mom got her hand burnt, that kind of stuff.
so that lends more to the theory of moving into a parallel universe where you have a completely different timeline. Um, just ask J.J. Abrams about different timelines. Um, if you like the new Star Trek reboots, which are pretty neat. But anyhow, neither here nor there. But um, that's interesting. So that at the point he went into the cabinet and went through this tunnel, it's almost like that's where the recollection would stop.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. That would take me a while to figure out, I think.
Yeah. So he apparently, realizing what was going on, knowing nobody would believe him, pulled his cell phone out and videotaped this guy for a couple minutes. Then it dawned on him, holy crap, can I even make it back where I came from? So he turned around and climbed. He said, I got to go. And back into the tunnel and back through the cabinet and back into his kitchen in his time. But he had that footage of him talking to himself.
That's a shame he didn't get a DNA sample.
It is.
Wow.
But was it,
Yeah.
did he
Well,
find a wormhole, or how did he, what happened? These stories are fascinating, and there's multitudes of them. That's the thing that makes it interesting. And it would be one thing if you're saying there are multitudes of them because people are putting them on Facebook and the internet. I get that. But these stories actually have their genesis, most of them prior to there being an internet, where they appeared in newspaper articles at the time. They're in people's private journals, stuff like that. So they weren't in a environment where this stuff was encouraged. In fact, a lot of these people don't tell their stories until many years later. The story of the two ladies that met Marie Antoinette, that was written in their journals, and then it was later, like 20 years later, that they published a book about their lives, and in that book they put this strange little vignette. And it was only later, as people were reading it, they're like, dude, that sounds like time travel.
I guess you have to be careful being labeled as a crackpot, or you may end up in an institution when you
Not
don't
so much
necessarily need to be.
today as it
Yeah.
was, a long time ago, saying
No, I mean,
something like
at
that.
that time. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but so people would write about it, but they would write about it in a very circumspect way. Or like the two businessmen I talked about, like they told a friend of theirs who was a newspaper reporter, who then did some research and said, oh my God, there really was a lady that disappeared on that road in 1940. And she did have a little girl in her car with her daughter, when they disappeared on that road. And, what a weird coincidence that you would claim to have seen exactly that. So, so those stories they're built previous to there being any mechanism for an internet or to share all this stuff. And these were the stories, frankly, that people maybe knew in a certain area, and nobody ever talked about them anywhere else until the last 30 years.
Yeah. So even if they would have got the license plate number from the 1940s car,
Hmm.
at that time there were no computer records. Everything was all done in paper. You know,
No.
so where would that? There'd be no way to research any of that just to see if that was actually a validly tagged vehicle, and who owned it.
Well, I will tell you one little story. I was going to end, but I'll give you this real quick story because of what you just said reminded me of it. So
Okay.
I was doing an investigation of a haunting, and the story very quickly was that this woman either committed suicide or was shot to death by her husband. This would have been 1940-ish, 1946, somewhere in that time frame. I think it was 1946. And she was found on the steps of a granary shed outside the main house on a little farm in the middle of nowhere out in Breezewood. And there was a rifle, shotgun, or excuse me, not rifle, shotgun beside her that they said she shot herself with. Now, her first husband had died when she was quite young, and she had two children, and she remarried, and the guy she remarried, or she married to, turned out to be not a good person. So he had been molesting her 14-year-old daughter, got her daughter pregnant, and that's how she found out about it. Okay. And she was trying to call the police and report this man for what he had done. And the story that the family tells is that he kind of he harassed her. He wouldn't let her go to sleep. He kept her in his sights, and then eventually they believe he shot her. Now, there's a caveat to he shot her, is that everybody said it was a suicide. He joins World War II and supposedly gives confesses to a minister or a priest before he dies, and this minister or priest writes this down, and then when he comes stateside again, he goes to find the family and say, look, this is what this guy told me, and that in that way the story completes. Now, the reason I'm telling you the story is part of the haunting is that they will hear an old rotary phone going. Now, young people today have no clue what a rotary phone is, let alone that the way it worked. So in a rotary phone, if you put your finger in the little hole that said 6 and you rolled it around, and when you pulled your finger out, it would make 6 clicks before it went back to the 6.
Mm-hmm.
7 make 7 clicks, and so on. So the lady that owned the house when I knew of the house, would hear this at night in the basement. There was a phone on the wall in the basement, and it was an older phone. And she started taping the clicks and eventually was able to put a phone number together, a phone number that did not have those first 3 digits we have now, the 814 for our area or whatever it is,
Right.
the area code numbers. And she wrote it down, and she went to the local phone company and said, is there any way you can trace this number? Well, the person knew her pretty well and kind of believed her story because everybody in the area knew the story about this house. And they did have records of the phone numbers. And in 1940, that phone number belonged to the lady that lived in that house. But there was no way to call on that phone, and that phone was completely disabled. In fact, she actually had it taken off the wall, and you would still hear the clicking as though somebody. So she said, I always thought that she got snuck down to the basement and tried to make that phone call, and he caught her, and that's what happened.
And so that plays over and over again.
Yeah, so she's still trying to call for help.
The things that people do, just
it's a tragic story in every way, but it just the fact that something is going on, and that she could actually trace it down and find out that it actually had come from that house, or at least the phone number was associated.
Yeah, that's amazing that there were records going back that far.
Yeah. But the little local phone company down there had kept them, and there it was.
Well, like a local phone company, where someone would go down to the basement, pull open a drawer, and start thumbing through index cards looking for that number.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I thought it was a fascinating story because she was so excited by the fact that they could trace that line back. So and so you have to wonder. I think maybe sometimes it's a lot of different things. I don't think they're all going to have the same answer. So some of them might be time slips, and some of them might be wormholes, and some of them might be other things, because there's just a lot of different things that can happen.
Makes you, if they can happen, just why do they happen naturally? I mean, so if something like that, so let's say that there is an Einstein-Rosen bridge, their wormhole,
right.
And it's does it naturally occur, or did somebody make it happen?
I think it occurs both ways. I think sometimes they're spontaneous. Why do storms happen? Why do certain places get tornadoes all the time? Whatever. And then I think sometimes people make it happen. And that's a very good place to leave it, because the next time we get together, my friend, I'm going to tell you some stories about people who claim they made it happen.
Interesting. Okay. And so anybody who wants to hear about that can, number one, any of our podcast outlets that you're currently listening to this podcast on, and there's like 9 different podcast platforms. We also have a YouTube channel, the Paranormalist Podcast. We have a Facebook page of the same name, the Paranormalist Podcast. We have an email address, paranormalist@theparanormalistpodcast.com. And everybody has the Paranormalist Podcast in common. So, and in any of the existing places, I always have a link for that underneath the either the video or in the description of the audio, so you can find those easily. But we'd love to hear your stories, love to hear your feedback. Please comment on the videos, click that like button on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. We have relatively few subscribers right now, but we'd like to get some more, and I'm sure you would.
Oh, yes. I'm looking forward to watching it grow again. And I know it will, because, there's good stories, and it's not this is necessarily the storyteller, but there's definitely some good stories, and people just really enjoy hearing them. And to be honest with you, the world being what it is, sometimes it's good to take a break and just think about something pleasant for a while.
Man. I like that. So, on that note, Ms. Patty, I'm going to say good evening to you, and we're going to say so long to our listeners and viewers, and hope to see you next time.
Yep. Good night, everybody.